It's happening again. One of those rare windows in the calendar when multiple natural cycles quietly line up, creating a moment that feels almost invisible while it's happening, yet surprisingly meaningful when we look back later. This is why many people are beginning to pay attention to the days surrounding the new moon and the spring equinox. Because when these two events appear so close together, something interesting tends to unfold. Not necessarily something dramatic or obvious, but something subtle that changes the direction of how people think, what they notice, and sometimes even the decisions they make next. Over the next few days, the sky presents a sequence that has been observed for thousands of years. First, the lunar cycle resets with the new moon. Then the Earth itself reaches one of its most balanced moments of the year during the spring equinox. And almost immediately after that balance appears, the Sun enters Aries, the first sign of the zodiac, symbolizing the beginning of a new, energetic cycle. When moments like this arrive close together, it creates what many people describe as a reset point. Not because the sky suddenly changes human destiny, but because natural cycles have always influenced how people interpret timing. Humans have always looked to the sky for signals about when to pause, when to prepare, and when to begin something new. And if you think about it, this idea isn't strange at all. We already do it constantly in everyday life. The start of a new year encourages people to rethink their goals. The beginning of a new week often motivates someone to try again with a habit they struggled with before. Even something as simple as the first day of a month can feel like a fresh page. The new moon works in a similar way, but it carries a deeper symbolism. Unlike the full moon that fills the sky with light, the new moon does something very different. It disappears. For a brief period, the moon vanishes from sight entirely. The sky becomes darker because the lunar cycle has reached its reset point. Ancient observers noticed this long before astronomy explained the mechanics behind it. They simply watched the sky and saw that the moon would gradually fade away until it was gone, only to slowly return again as a thin sliver of light. And they interpreted this disappearance in a fascinating way. They believed the moon was showing something important about renewal. The previous cycle doesn't blend gently into the next one. It ends completely before the next one begins. That moment of darkness became symbolic. It represented the idea that before something new begins, there is often a pause, a space where the old momentum fades away. This is why many cultures considered the new moon a time of reflection rather than action. It was the moment to step back and ask a simple question. What direction do I actually want the next cycle to move in? Because when the moon reappears again, the cycle has already begun. Now here's where this particular moment becomes especially interesting. The new moon does not appear in isolation this time. Just as the lunar cycle resets, the Earth itself reaches one of its most balanced moments during the spring equinox. The equinox is one of the most remarkable events in the natural calendar. On this day, the tilt of the Earth produces nearly equal amounts of daylight and darkness across the planet. Day and night stand in perfect balance. This balance only happens twice a year. For ancient civilizations, this moment carried enormous significance. Entire calendars were built around it. Farmers watched for it because it marked the return of the growing season. Travelers recognized it as the signal that the long stillness of winter was ending. And philosophers saw something deeper inside it. The equinox demonstrated a powerful truth about cycles. Balance is not the end of movement. Balance is the doorway to movement. Once the scales reach equilibrium, the direction begins to shift again. After the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, something subtle but powerful begins happening. Each day, the sun rises a little earlier. Each evening stretches a little longer. Gradually, light begins occupying more space in the sky than darkness. In other words, the balance tips toward growth. And this year, something even more symbolic happens right after this balance appears. The sun moves into Aries. Now, Aries is not just another zodiac sign. In traditional astrology, Aries represents the starting point of the entire zodiac wheel. It is the place where the cycle begins again at 0 degrees. That's why many ancient cultures did not treat January as the beginning of the year at all. In older systems, the true beginning of the year was tied to the Spring Equinox and the sun entering Aries, because that was when the natural world itself was starting over.
If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe for daily cosmic insights, astrology updates, and spiritual guidance, because the universe always has a message for you.
Plants begin growing again. Animals become more active. The earth moves from stillness into momentum. Aries represents the archetype of the pioneer, the one who moves first. Unlike other signs that prefer careful planning or patience, Aries energy is about initiation. It represents the moment when someone decides to begin something before knowing exactly how the entire path will unfold. And that is what makes this week so interesting. Within just a few days, 3 different cycles reach their reset point almost simultaneously. The lunar cycle resets with the new moon. The seasonal cycle resets with the spring equinox, and the zodiac cycle resets when the sun enters Aries. When multiple cycles restart at once, it creates the symbolic feeling that something is beginning again across several layers of time. Now here's the fascinating part. Moments like this rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. There are no fireworks in the sky announcing that a turning point has arrived. Life continues as normal. People go to work. Conversations happen. Small decisions get made. But if you look back months later, you might notice something curious. A certain idea appeared around this time. A realization surfaced that changed how you saw a situation. A conversation happened that quietly shifted a relationship or a plan. Turning points rarely look important in the moment. They look ordinary while they are happening. Only later do we realize that something quietly changed direction during that time. This is why the energy surrounding the new moon and the equinox can feel unusual. Not necessarily intense or chaotic, but reflective. People start noticing things they had been ignoring. Questions appear that weren't obvious before. Sometimes it shows up as clarity, a realization about what direction no longer feels right. Sometimes it appears as curiosity, an idea that suddenly feels worth exploring. And sometimes it's even simpler than that, a quiet sense that something new wants to begin. The interesting thing about beginnings is that they rarely feel comfortable at first. We tend to romanticize fresh starts as exciting and inspiring. But in reality, most genuine beginnings feel strange before they feel empowering. Imagine walking from a dim room into bright sunlight. At first, your eyes struggle to adjust. The brightness feels overwhelming. Only after a few moments do you begin to see clearly. Growth often works the same way. The beginning of a new cycle can feel uncertain because the old momentum has faded, but the new direction has not fully formed yet. And that space in between can feel unfamiliar. But it is also where possibility lives. Because when the previous pattern disappears, the future is no longer locked into the same direction. This is why weeks like this are often described as energetic resets. Not because the sky is forcing anything to happen, but because it creates a symbolic mirror that reminds us how cycles work. Everything in nature moves through phases: preparation, stillness, beginning, growth. And sometimes we find ourselves standing at the doorway between those phases. The new moon clears the page. The equinox restores balance, and Aries energy encourages the first step. Taken together, they form a simple message. Something is beginning again. The question is not whether the world will move forward. It always does. The real question is whether we notice the moment when a new path quietly opens. Because sometimes life doesn't announce a turning point with dramatic events. Sometimes it appears as a subtle shift in perspective. A thought that feels different from the ones you had before. A small decision that leads somewhere unexpected. And when you look back later, you realize that the moment everything started changing didn't look important at all. It looked like an ordinary day. So, as this new moon and spring equinox unfold, there is only one thing worth doing. Pay attention. Not with pressure, not with the feeling that something must happen, but with curiosity. Notice what ideas appear in your mind. Notice what conversations seem more meaningful than usual. Notice which directions suddenly feel more interesting than they did before. Because sometimes the beginning of something important arrives quietly. And if you're still here listening to this, take it as a small reminder that cycles always move forward. Darkness fades. Light returns. Momentum builds again. The Earth demonstrates this every single year, and in many ways, our lives follow the same rhythm. So wherever you are right now in your journey, remember this. You may be closer to the beginning of something new than you realize. And sometimes, the most powerful resets happen not when the world changes overnight, but when a quiet moment inspires you to take the very first step. If you've been paying attention to the days surrounding this new moon and the spring equinox, you may have already noticed something subtle beginning to shift. Not necessarily in the outside world, but in the way your mind has been processing things. Because moments like this tend to bring something interesting to the surface. They don't always create dramatic events, but they often create clarity. And clarity has a very quiet way of changing everything. When the sun moves into Aries right after the equinox, the atmosphere of the year begins to feel slightly different. Aries has always been associated with the idea of the first step, not the perfect step, not the carefully planned step, just the first one. This is why Aries energy has often been described as courageous, not because it is fearless, but because it moves forward before everything is fully figured out. Think about how most people approach change. They wait. They wait until the timing feels perfect. They wait until they understand every detail. They wait until they feel completely confident that the decision will work out. But here's the strange truth about life. Perfect certainty almost never arrives before the first step. It usually appears after. And that is exactly what Aries energy represents. The willingness to begin the journey before the entire map is visible. This is why the days following the equinox can sometimes feel like a quiet push forward. People start feeling less interested in sitting still with old situations that have already run their course. Ideas that once seemed intimidating begin to look a little more possible. Sometimes this shows up as motivation, a sudden urge to try something new, a creative idea that feels exciting instead of overwhelming. Other times, it shows up as honesty, a realization that something in your life no longer fits who you are becoming. The interesting thing about these realizations is that they often appear during calm moments, when the noise of daily life quiets down for a second and your mind has space to think. And that brings us to something that many people overlook when talking about cycles like the new moon and the equinox. The real power of these moments is not the sky itself. The real power is the pause. When life moves at full speed, people rarely stop long enough to ask themselves meaningful questions. Days blur together. Weeks pass without reflection. Decisions get made out of habit instead of intention. But when a symbolic reset appears in the calendar, even if only subconsciously, people tend to pause. They look back for a moment. They ask themselves simple but important questions. Where am I going? What direction actually feels right? What do I want this next chapter to look like? And sometimes, Just asking those questions is enough to create a shift. Because once someone becomes aware that a pattern is no longer serving them, it becomes very difficult to continue repeating it the same way. This is why many turning points in life begin with awareness rather than action. A single realization can change the direction of everything that follows. Now imagine how powerful it can be when that awareness arrives during a moment when nature itself is demonstrating a reset. The moon disappearing and beginning again, the earth balancing light and darkness, the sun stepping into the very first sign of the zodiac. It's almost like the universe is quietly reminding us how cycles work. Nothing stays frozen forever. Even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring. Even the darkest night eventually makes room for the sunrise. And in the same way, moments of uncertainty in our own lives eventually lead somewhere new. But there is one important truth about beginnings that many people forget. Beginnings require participation. The universe can present opportunities. Life can offer turning points. Timing can create a window where things feel possible again. But someone still has to take the step. And that step doesn't have to be dramatic. It might be as simple as starting a conversation that you've been avoiding. It might be deciding to pursue an idea that you once dismissed. It might be letting go of something that no longer feels aligned with the direction you want your life to move. Small steps often lead to the biggest changes because they create momentum. And momentum is one of the most powerful forces in life. Once movement begins, new possibilities start appearing that were invisible before. Think about how often people say something like this when looking back on their past. If I hadn't made that one small decision, my entire life would have unfolded differently. At the time, that decision probably didn't feel monumental. It probably felt like a simple choice on an ordinary day. But that is exactly how turning points tend to work. They arrive quietly. And this is why the message of this particular week is not about predicting the future or expecting something dramatic to happen overnight. The message is much simpler. Pay attention to the direction your life seems to be nudging you toward, because sometimes the most important signals are the quiet ones. A feeling that it's time to try something new. A sense that you're ready to close a chapter that once mattered, but no longer fits. A curiosity about a path you hadn't considered before. Those subtle nudges often appear right before a new cycle begins, and that is exactly where we are right now. A new moon clearing the slate, a spring equinox restoring balance, and the bold, forward-moving energy of Aries encouraging the first step into the next chapter. So if the past few days have felt reflective, or if the coming days feel like they're quietly pushing you forward, don't ignore that feeling. Sometimes life doesn't shout when it's time to begin again. Sometimes it whispers. And the people who notice those whispers are often the ones who discover new paths that others never see. As this new cycle unfolds, remain curious, remain open, and most importantly, remain willing to move when the moment feels right. Because you never know. This small window in time might be the exact moment when the next chapter of your story begins.